Hello everybody around the world and in Grenada that's watching this. I'm Kim, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm speaking from a cocoa plantation that my wife and I own here in Grenada. Some of you have been here and probably a lot of you haven't, so I'm going to talk a bit about the estate, how we run the place and our end product, etc, etc. First of all, a little bit about cocoa. When I came here 14 years ago, I didn't even know that cocoa grew on trees, and maybe some of you are in the same situation. It's a remarkable tree, stands up very, very well through bad weather and drought and hurricane and so forth, very versatile in that sense. It's almost a continuous harvest throughout the year. Although it's a deciduous tree like apples and pears, a lot of deciduous trees in the tropics, they constantly shed their leaves and they constantly bear fruit. The amount of fruit they bear varies throughout the year. Even if you've got a very small farm, then there'll be periods of time that you don't pick because the amount that you'd pick isn't worth the effort putting into it. So if you see a cocoa tree without any leaves, it's not the winter, it means it's dead. So they always have leaves on them. We're an organic farm, or in fact we're an organic enterprise. Most people, if you say the word organic, they really only think in terms of food and what they're getting on their plate. And if you ask them why do they eat organic food, they're going to say because it's better for me. I see organic as completely different. I see the world as one living thing. And everything on that world is like the cells in our body. They all go together to make up the world. And so we have to look after everything in this world to keep the balance. It means looking after each other. It means looking after the plants, the animals, the boulders, even the dreaded mosquito, which I hate, but the mosquito is there for a reason. So we don't use sprays and things like that. Obviously, our physical farming is organic with no chemicals involved, but the farming aspect goes beyond that. Here in Grenada, farm workers who work incredibly hard and are very skillful, they earn a pittance for what they do. And to me, that's a form of slavery. They live from week to week. They are in constant debt to the local shop for flour, constant debt to the busman for taking the kids to school. And very simple things they just can't afford, a set of reading glasses, a car, and simpler things, washing machines, they just can't afford it. They can't borrow money or get them on hire purchase because they have no collateral. So farm workers are pretty much trapped in a level of poverty which they can't escape from. And I can't be part of that system because that is just economic slavery. It's slavery without the chains. So what we've done here, first of all, because it's organic cocoa, we do get a higher price because the price for normal cocoa is ridiculously low, which is why agriculture is dying here. That price is controlled by the corporates, and the corporates don't care about you or me. We're just a commodity, much the same as beans or cotton. What we've done here to break the corporate chain and to give the farm workers a decent income is we don't give them any wage at all. What we have given them is absolute control over the lands, and everything, including the cocoa bean that comes off the land, belongs to those farm workers. We guarantee that we will buy the cocoa bean at absolutely top price from those farm workers. So when they're picking cocoa, they get very large sums of cash money which they can put in the bank, fix their house, buy a washing machine, improve their lives. When there's no cocoa, they don't get any money for cocoa, but all the bananas, all the nutmeg, the oranges, the pigeon pea, the mango, and I can't remember the rest of the list, all of those things belong to those farm workers and they sell them down the market. So they have a steady income even when there's no cocoa being picked. People think I'm crazy because I'm basically not making a profit off of the land. The profit for me is huge. It's not a financial profit. It's a profit of knowing that I'm helping other people improve their lives. It's a profit of those people being my friends. We have a relationship between employee and employer I've never seen before, because there's absolute trust and respect. I don't have to follow them around the lands making sure they're working. We don't have to keep any timesheets. It's a wonderful, wonderful relationship, and it's balanced. They make enough money and we make enough money from processing the beans. And so this is what I mean by organic and balanced. We are looking after each other, and that's our farming method. We also practice companion planting. It's where you use one plant to help another. Basically we use the banana for this. When we plant young cocoa trees, which are about 14 inches high, we plant a banana stall, root, about 8 inches away from it. The banana grows much quicker and provides shade to the young cocoa. And also in times of drought, the cocoa can actually draw water from the base of the banana tree, and so it's keeping the cocoa tree alive through the drought season. After 2 years, we cut the banana down and get the fruit. What's been cut down puts potassium into the land, so that's one of our fertilizers covered by banana. And the young cocoa tree is good to go. So that's our companion planting. We also practice a little bit of permaculture, in as much that anything that's growing wild, and we haven't got the camera above it, but right above me is a huge legume tree. I can see 3 of them from where I'm sitting. They're not doing any harm to the cocoa at all. In fact, they're helping the cocoa by producing a dappled shade, and they produce nitrogen. So wild things that are growing amongst the cocoa, we don't cut down, we don't destroy them. It's not like a commercial farm where you clear everything and plant one crop. We allow things to be in balance. And most of these things help each other. The fruit trees that are growing amongst the cocoa actually add to the flavors of the cocoa and the final chocolate, which we'll talk about later on this video. I think I've covered the farming side of it as quickly as I can on this video, so we'll probably switch off, or you might follow me with it as we wander down to the next stage. Crayfish Bay has 3 major aims or projects, if you like. One is that we are truly organic in the true sense, that we're looking after every living thing, including each other. We've already covered that earlier in this video. The next thing is, Grenada produces some of the finest cocoa beans in the world. This is not just my opinion, this is the opinion of the experts. And for years and years and years, it's just been sold to the corporates and mixed in with your Cadburys and your Hershey's and all the other rubbish they sell out there in the real world. And so our second project, if you like, is to try and produce some of the world's finest chocolate, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. Our third project is to show Grenadian farmers who are incredibly poor how they can take their cocoa bean and turn it into something else at home without huge investments, without borrowing money from banks, and actually make a decent living off of their farm. And that's going to come later. Right now we're in what's called the sweat. That's the local name for it. I think in the official chocolate world it's called the fermentary. This is what the cocoa pod looks like when it comes off the tree. This is a fairly small one. And the first thing we'll do with the cocoa pod is crack it. And we're going to crack it by taking a machete, cutting the end off and splitting it like that. Inside are white beans which are covered in slime. We bring those beans and the slime down to this building, the sweat or the fermentary, and what we do here is we ferment them. And in the process of making high quality artisan chocolate, full of different flavors, the sweat or the fermentary here is the most important part of the process. If you get this wrong, you will not produce good chocolate. This has been proven many times, and I proved it to myself when the fermentation went wrong one time. I'm sitting in one of the sweat bins here. We put the beans in, a minimum of 300 pounds. We cover them with banana leaves and sacking, A, to keep dirt out, and B, to keep heat in. And let's think what's actually happening with this fermentation. The slime on the outside of the beans, which by the way tastes wonderful, it tastes like a combination of every Caribbean fruit you've got in Grenada, that slime is highly acidic. The centre of the bean, which is called the nib, which is what we want for chocolate making, is a low acidity. The aim is that those two acidities become the same. How is this achieved? Well, most of it is totally natural. The slime starts to break down and become watery. And as it breaks down and becomes watery, it becomes very, very mildly alcoholic. As it becomes as thin as water, it can penetrate into the end of the bean through a hole called the germ, which is microscopic. Once it gets in there, it starts to raise the acidity of the nib, and the alcohol which is in that liquid starts to break down the proteins in the nib, and this is where your flavours get released. It stays in here for about 5 days. Each day we do a pH test on the slime and we do a pH test on the nib. Slowly the slime comes down in acidity and slowly the nib comes up. And we want them either the same or the nib can be slightly lower in acidity. The important thing is that the nib doesn't go above acidity above the slime. If that happens, you get a sourness in the nib which you can't get rid of. It will go right through to the end product. I'm sure the commercial companies have ways of getting rid of it with chemicals and other flavours and blah blah blah, but that's not where we're at. So after 5 days, when the acids are right, we take the beans out and we dry them. We'll show you that in a moment. The other thing, a product of fermentation, a byproduct if you like, is heat. Now, fermentation is the same whatever you're fermenting, whether it's grapes for wine, apples for cider, grass for silage, cocoa beans, whatever. The fermentation is basically the same thing. Now with a wine, it's producing heat, the same as cocoa, but a wine is a liquid. So you get a natural thermal movement in the liquid. With cocoa bean you don't get that because it's a solid. And if we just left it in a heap for 5 days, the middle of the heap would get so hot that you couldn't put your hand in it. This is why silage heaps will catch fire sometimes. And you would have terrific over fermentation in the center of the heap. The outside edges would only get warm and you'd have a lot of under fermentation. So what we do is each day we turn those beans over with a shovel to get them all mixed up, and they all get roughly the same treatment. We take a temperature test every day, as we don't want it to go above 50 degrees Celsius. If it does, that would result in over fermentation. It's never happened to us, but we do take that temperature test every day just as a security measure. When they come out, they're no longer white and slimy. They're now a dark honey colour and sticky, as though they're covered in honey, almost thick honey or marmalade. That's what they feel like. At that stage, they're ready to go out to the drying drawers. Okay, so this is where we dry the cocoa after it's been fermented. These are called the drawers. The cocoa is going to stay out here anything between 7 and 20 days. It depends entirely on the weather. We need a nice breeze, and clear skies with plenty of sun is perfect. And occasionally we get it perfect. We have to watch over it very carefully. If it rains on it and it makes the beans wet after a few days, then it's a disaster. So whenever it starts to rain, or it looks like it's going to start to rain, we push these drawers in. We're also constantly turning the cocoa. We usually do this with our feet. It's called tramping. And by turning the cocoa, you're exposing all the different beans to the sun and the breeze blowing through them. After they're dry, I don't know if Artie can pick this up, this is what they look like. And that is now dry, and I don't know if you heard that, but it went crispy like a packet of chips. Hopefully you can see a very thin skin on the outside and this dark mass in the middle. It's the dark mass we want for making chocolate. It's called the nib. So the first thing we have to do with these dry beans to make them into chocolate is to get rid of that skin, and we're going to go and see that next. So how are we going to get rid of that skin? What we do is we roast the bean, and when you roast the bean, that nib shrinks away from the skin and the skin becomes very brittle like an eggshell. The way we're going to do that is by, first of all, we're going to roast it, and this is our roaster. First of all, I'm going to talk about why we roast, how we roast, and secondly I'm going to tell you about the roaster itself. So when we roast, what happens is the nib shrinks away from the skin and the skin becomes as brittle as an eggshell, so it's easy to get off. How do we roast? We don't want to roast too hot. If you roast at a very high heat, like the corporates do, you will get rid of the acidity and the bitterness very quickly and cheap. But in doing it that way, getting rid of the acids by heat, you destroy all the flavours. And as I said earlier, we're searching to make fine chocolate, so we want to retain those flavours. So we roast at a low temperature for about 12 to 14 minutes. We roast for a fairly short time at a low temperature. Now, most commercial roasters are going to roast at a specific temperature for a specific time, regardless of what beans go in. So in other words, in their world, one size fits all. Now, cocoa beans, even though they come from the same trees and they've gone through the same fermentation process and through the same drying process, they vary enormously. First of all, you've got size. Certain areas of the plantation produce a smaller bean. You've also got water content. Although we call them dry, they've still got about 6 to 7% water content in them. There's also, I don't know how to describe it, there's a moisture content dependent on whether they've grown through a long dry period or through a wet season, and all of these things affect flavors. And also, if you're going to roast them to what I call perfection, the roast temperatures and the roast times will vary. And so rather than having a machine that tells me when the beans are roasted, I let the beans tell me. And everything I do here to roasting beans, I judge the beans as done when they smell right and when they're cracking like popcorn. Some will take 12 minutes, some might take 16 minutes. It doesn't matter. It's not about the clock and it's not about the computer, it's about the bean telling us when it's cooked. And so that's how we roast. We take them out after that period of time and we spread them in a tray and let them cool. And that's the roasting finished. Now, the roaster itself. I told you earlier that one of the projects we have here is to show Grenadian cocoa farmers how they can enhance their product and make it into something else and get a decent living from their farm. When I was just selling cocoa beans, I couldn't earn enough money to live. When I say live, I mean I do have a vehicle, I like to have a computer, and I like to have electricity. I had enough money for those, but I certainly didn't have enough money for medication or for going on holiday or getting a new car or any of those things like many people have, or 2 phones, which I still don't have and I don't want. The first thing we needed was a roaster. Now, I went online looking for a roaster capable of roasting 50 pounds of cocoa beans, and found them in the States. Chinese ones were cheaper, but I don't trust Chinese machinery. And the ones in the States were 180,000 US dollars, which is a figure I can hardly write, let alone speak. And I think we had about $2,000 or $3,000 at the time. So at that point I had a choice. I could either go to the bank and borrow money, put myself in debt, which I couldn't have paid, or I could just give up on the whole project, or I could look at it and find another way of roasting, which is what I did. This roaster here is built primarily from garbage that I found on the island. We've been using it very successfully for 4 years now, and I have no intention of changing it. It costs less than $1,000. The most expensive part was the perforated drum in this inside, that's stainless steel, that cost $600. So the roaster itself saved us, what, $179,000 plus customs duties, plus. I then had to decide what to use for fuel. For the sake of argument, every cocoa roaster in the world is the heat source is either gas, electricity or diesel. So what alternatives did we have in Grenada? And I came up with the idea of using charcoal. Chocolate makers around the world said I was crazy and it wouldn't work. And my answer to them was, have you tried? Well, no, they said, it won't work. So, okay, I decided to try it. And it works perfectly. It produces the most beautiful chocolate. And the wonderful thing about charcoal, using the charcoal, is that the people who make charcoal in the villages are some of the poorest of the poor. It's incredibly hard work. They have a problem selling it because they have to get it to town or get it to market. And it's hard, really hard. I go along to these people, I take my truck down there and I'll buy a year's supply off them. And for them, that is the equivalent of you people that are watching this, it's the equivalent of them winning the lottery. They can fix the roof on their house. They can get the kids some glasses or some medication. They actually have, you know, a couple of $1,000s in their hand, probably the only time in their life. So it's, again, this is organic. It's about looking after the people around you. It's about looking after everything and sharing. People have asked me whether it's more expensive to cook with charcoal rather than gas or electricity. And my answer is, I don't know and I don't care. Because the profit for me is knowing that other people are benefiting from it, that need those benefits. Okay, so here we're continuing with what we do with the cocoa bean. We're also continuing on homemade machinery and how young people can set up a chocolate factory for a very, very, very small amount of money. Give you an idea, we were quoted $250,000 to set up this factory, not including the building. That was just for the machinery. We set the entire factory up, with the building and the machinery, everything, yeah, for $35,000 over a period of 5 years. So we didn't borrow money. And this is what I want to encourage young Grenadians to do. They don't have to produce chocolate. They can produce chocolate liqueur, they can produce nibs, they can produce cookies. There's all sorts of things you can do with chocolate, yeah? The point I'm making is that you can do it with homemade machinery, basically built from garbage, and you do not have to borrow from banks because they love young people to borrow, because once a young person has borrowed a lot of money, that young person is in the slave chain for the rest of their lives, as many of you probably are. And I'm not criticizing any of those people, it's the system that's been created. We take those beans that have been roasted, and what we've got over here is an old farmyard grinder from the States. You can buy a proper machine for breaking these cocoa beans. Only does one thing, and that's crack cocoa beans, and they're about $1,000 US. Or you can pick one of these up on eBay for as little as 20 bucks. The wonderful thing about it is it will crack cocoa bean, but it will also grind corn down to flour. It will grind cocoa nib down to a paste. It will grind cinnamon down to flour. It will grind many things. So a very, very versatile machine, which is very useful to our village. They come up here with their corn. I grind it for them. They don't have to pay me. I take a pound of corn for every 20 pounds I grind. They love it. Normally they have to catch a bus, pay the bus fare, pay the man for the grinding when he remembers to turn up, etc., etc. So this, again, it's good for us. It's good for the community. It's good for everybody. So that's that one. Now I'm going to come over to Artie. I'm going to show you what the beans look like after we've put them through here. I'll do it on this table here, Artie, if the light's good enough. Yeah. So after the beans have been through the cracker, they basically come out looking like that. So now we have a mixture of broken nib and broken skin. We still have to separate them, and for that we needed a winnowing machine. The word winnowing comes from wind. In the old days, with the corn and with other things that needed, The waste product, in this case it's the skin, is called the chaff. And in the old days they used to put it on a blanket when on a windy day 6 people or 10 people would stand around the blanket throwing it up in the air, and the wind would carry away the chaff. So to winnow comes from the word wind. Now a winnowing machine, they vary in cost. For a small one like we've got, the same capacity, would probably cost around about $8,000 US dollars. The sky's the limit in terms of the cost of winnowing machines. Companies like Cadbury's and so forth, their winnowing machines are going to run into millions of dollars. And as I said at the beginning, we've done all of this with no loans and very little finance. So I looked at the $8,000 ones and I thought, well, that's not rocket science. So if you want to spin round onto this wonderful piece of kit we've got here, Artie, this is the Crayfish Bay Acme do-it-yourself winnowing machine, total cost $90. At this point I'd like to add that it's more efficient than the one up the road, which cost $10,000. The way it works is very, very simple. You don't have to be an engineer to build this stuff. As you can see, this is just an old gas bottle, cooking gas bottle, cut top off, found that on the side of the road. This is an old juicer machine I got on eBay for 10 bucks because the blades were missing, which is fine, I didn't want blades. This table was a stroke of luck. I was going to make this out of plywood, bits of timber lying around. When I was building it, a friend of mine rang me up and asked me to move a load of kitchen equipment for him down to one of the boats to go to another island. And I said, certainly. And he said, how much do you want? And I said, I don't know, I'll see what the load is. And when I got to look at the load, amongst everything else, there were about 6 of these tables. So I rang him up and I said, it won't cost you any money, I want one of your tables. So that one came. This box down here, the microwave door on the front serves absolutely no purpose at all, except everybody thinks it's a microwave door there for a reason. I didn't want to throw it away and I thought it made the whole thing look nice. So, what did I pay for? Paid for a vacuum cleaner, which goes on this end here. How it works, I take the mixture from that grinder, the broken skin and nib, I put it in this gas bottle. I've got the hoover goes at that end. I'm not walking across the camera. When the hoover is switched on, it's pulling air up this pipe through here, across the top of the box and out through the hoover. So that's your airflow. When I switch this on, it spins inside here, and that causes a tiny little bit of vibration, which you can't actually see, which causes the mixture to run through this pipe. The spinning yoke in here regulates the flow. It comes down into this system. Once it hits that system, the skin is lighter than the nib, gets picked up and dropped in the box, and the nib goes straight down into a bucket. And it's really efficient and very simple. For people in the know, if I start at 5:30 in the morning with roasting, by 4 o'clock in the afternoon I have roasted, cracked and winnowed 200 pounds of dry beans on my own without breaking a sweat. And for a total investment cost of around about $1,200 US. Now normally, if you didn't have the machine, that would take one person certainly more than a week. And if you went and bought the machines, you would have invested around about $200,000. So there's a saving of almost $199,000 US. The figures sound ridiculous, but this is the fact of the matter. And this is why most people won't set up a small factory, because they have to borrow money. And you know, if you invest that amount of money, it takes a long time to get back, and the bank's chasing you for it every month from the first month. And so this is what I'm trying to show young kids. You can do it without having a lot of money. Now we've got our nibs and we're ready to start chocolate making. As you know, this is Chocolate Fest, virtual. I'm not a computer person, so I'm not too sure about this. Normally when we do a tour, we have our machines working, the factory is working. I can give you all a taste of our wonderful chocolate, and none of that's going to happen today, although Artie and his mate here will get some chocolate most definitely. I'll take you in the factory briefly, talk about what the different machines do and how we do it and why we do it and so forth. Okay. So this is our tiny little micro factory. It looks quite professional these days. When we started with a tiny little grinder. Artie might be able to show you one later, there's one actually behind him. A tiny little grinder and a homemade vibrating table. And that was the only equipment we really had. We had no tempering machines, we had no melters. Everything was done by hand on a shoestring. And our official tour on Chocolate Fest is actually called Chocolate Making on a Shoestring. As time went on, we could afford this, we could afford that. We've got a big grinder over there that a company in London threw out. It's a very cheap one, not made for chocolate at all, it's made for making dal. They gave it to us. I switched it on and it was running at 1500 revs, and those two walls there were covered in chocolate. But I didn't give up at that stage. I got a 3-phase motor for £100 and a regulator for about another 80. So for less than £200 we've got a really good grinder, 20-pound capacity, normally cost about £5,000. And again, this is what I'm telling local kids. Take your junk, take what's lying around in the yard, see what you can make with it, think outside the box. Don't be afraid to come and ask me, I'll help you for nothing. I'm really willing to help, because I want to see the Grenadian people freed up from the corporates and freed up from the banks in terms of agriculture. What we do in here, we take those nibs from the winnowing machine and we put them in these two grinders over here. Most companies are going to grind for maybe 24 hours. We grind for 5 days non-stop. This is done for two reasons. One is we want to produce incredibly smooth chocolate, but without putting any additives in. Artie and his partner have just tasted some of his chocolate, and I know they will hopefully come on shot and show you eating chocolate and what they think of it. And maybe let me operate the camera then, Artie. The other reason we do it, I explained that we roast at a low temperature to retain the different flavours. The problem with roasting at a low temperature is it doesn't destroy the acids, and you have very bitter chocolate if you make it the normal way. By grinding or conching for 5-6 days sometimes, it's getting up to about 50 degrees Celsius. Now that is hot enough to lift off the volatiles, which are those acids, but not hot enough to destroy the flavour profile. So this is how we lower the acids. This is why our chocolate is not bitter. Although it's a low percentage sugar and there's no additives, it's not bitter and it has a nice long aftertaste. After it's been in there, the next thing we do is, instead of pouring that into moulds and selling a bar of chocolate, which is what most companies do, we take that liquor, we pour it into 5-pound blocks and we age it the same way as you age wine or good quality cheese. It doesn't create flavours, but it changes the shape of the flavour profile. If any of you have taken a really young, we'll say Bordeaux wine, which would normally be aged from 2 years up to, well, the sky's the limit. If any of you have drunk it very young, you know that the first thing you will get is a very sharp acid hit, and then you'll get sharp flavours. What happens when you age wine, and chocolate is exactly the same, it doesn't change those flavours, but the flavour profile, instead of being spiky, is a much more gentle run like this, and it lengthens the aftertaste. And it's a pleasant aftertaste because we haven't added fats and cocoa butter and so forth. You don't need a drink of water after you've eaten the chocolate. You don't crave a beer, which you often do with regular chocolate or with fried food. I love fish and chips, and I do love that pint of Guinness afterwards, I must admit. So God bless the fats in fish and chips, but not in chocolate. After it's aged, I'll bring you, if you stay there, Artie, I'll just bring out the block. So I'll bring one of these over, if you can see it. These are the tiny grinders. Let me just hold on. Let me put that on there. All right. There we are. This is what we started with, one of these grinders and the homemade vibrating table. The homemade vibrating table was fun. It was made partly out of the remains of a Land Rover engine, and although it did do the job, the entire building was pretty much shaking, and you could hear it 100 yards away. After you'd been vibrating the chocolate for a couple of hours, you kind of walked like this for the rest of the day. But it worked for 3 or 4 months, and it got us making chocolate, and we got enough money to get a proper one. What you're looking at here next to me, as I say, this is the first grinder, the very small one that we started with. This is our homemade melting system. It's just kitchen equipment and a very cheap Chinese gas ring. You can buy commercial chocolate roasters. They run into hundreds and thousands of dollars, or you can do something like this for about 10 bucks. Now, I said that we age the chocolate, it changes the flavour profile. These are the blocks that we age in. Now, if you look at this, you can see it kind of looks like bad chocolate. It's not bad at all. What it is, it's not tempered. Tempering is where you lock the crystals, the different crystals. You've got fat crystals, cocoa solid crystals, sugar crystals. Sorry, I forgot to mention the sugar goes in the grinder for the 5 days as well with the chocolate, with the nibs. It hasn't been tempered. The various crystals haven't been locked together. And what's happening, this white here, this light colour, is actually cocoa butter. And it's where the cocoa butter has floated to the surface. Nothing wrong with it in terms of nutrition, doesn't look nice, and the texture might not be pleasant in your mouth if it's dried out in places where a lot of cocoa butter has moved away. What we're going to do this to make this into proper chocolate bars, let's have a look. This one has been aging since February, so March, April, so that one's been aging for 3 months. We'll give that one another couple of months before it goes into the next stage of the process. We're going to bring it out, we're going to put it into our melter, and we're going to melt it down. Once it's melted, we're going to put it back into a grinder, and we might just grind it for a couple of hours. That's just to get everyone mixed up and dancing again, bring it back to life, you know? And then we're ready for tempering. Can you swing round this way, Artie?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Okay, this is a tempering machine. There should be a pipe here, and these are the ones you see in the movies where you've got lovely liquid chocolate running through here. What it does, it lowers the temperature of the chocolate liquid. It lowers the temperature to about 28 degrees Celsius and then brings it back up to around about 31. I say around about because this is artisan chocolate and you cannot work with definitive numbers. It depends on several issues in the chocolate itself. My wife Lilette is an expert at this. Yeah, I feel quite sad being in here. We're filming this during lockdown, COVID virus. We were just on the brink of total success when this virus hit. This was our second tempering machine we bought, so we have two, one for each of our flavours. It took us a year to save up enough money to buy it. It arrived, we used it once, and then we had to shut down because of the virus. From the tempering machine, once it's tempered, we hold these moulds underneath the pipe which is pouring out the liquor. We put those onto a vibrating table that's just to settle the liquor and get any air bubbles out, and then we put it in a cold room for about 20 minutes. After 20 minutes you've got a lovely shiny bar of chocolate with good snap. And then we package it in the cold room, and there we have it, the final product. I don't know how any of you can get it at the moment. Grenada has absolutely no way of shipping chocolate without asking you to feel sorry for me. I'm just facts of life. Our income is slightly less than zero and has been for the last 2 months, and it looks like it will be for the foreseeable future. I don't know how we're going to survive this. Everyone thinks tourists coming back is going to be the answer to our prayers, but I actually can't see a lot of tourists coming over the next couple of years. Anyway, we're not finished yet. We're still making a little bit, and we're selling a little bit locally at, we're not actually making a profit on it. I'm just trying to turn what we have, which is cocoa beans, into money so that we can pay our electricity bill and things. Making a profit is not an important thing at this stage of the game. Also, by selling it very cheap to local people, it gives them a break, so they can afford to buy a bar of chocolate, because obviously we're not the only ones suffering. The people who work for us, we paid them a full wage until we just couldn't afford to pay them anymore. We got no help from the government, and those people are getting no help from the government. And I have a horrible feeling that things are going to get a lot worse before they get better in this country. I don't really know what the answer is, and if I do, I don't think I should make it public on this particular video. Thank you very much for visiting Crayfish Bay, and thank you very much for allowing me into your living room or your caravan or your tent or whatever you're living on in and around during this lockdown. If you're interested in getting our chocolate sometime in the future, just write to Crayfish Bay Organic Chocolate, Grenada, West Indies. It will get to us after a while, and we will try and get some to you by whichever method we can find. And we don't ask you to pay up front or anything like that. We're not like Amazon. Once you've got it, then somehow you can get the money to us one day later. We're cool. And if we can get our goodness to your lives, we're sharing and keeping it in balance, and that's great. All right, thank you very much. End of story.